Thank you for joining today's webinar, MSA Sheepmeat Update. My name is Jodie Rosé-O'Brien and I'm one of the Sheep Connect team. Tonight's webinar has been recorded. We'll upload the recording to the Sheep Connect SA YouTube channel in the coming days, and we welcome you to revisit the webinar yourself and share it with colleagues. Sheep Connect is supported by Australian Wool Innovation, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, and the Department of Primary Industries. For more information about Sheep Connect, go to our website or you can follow us on Twitter. Our presenter tonight is Laura Garland. Laura is the Meat Standards Australia Producer Engagement Officer based in Armidale. Laura's focus is at the producer end of the supply chain, and Laura works with producers to utilise carcass feedback and increase the awareness and compliance of MSA specifications with the overall aim of improving the eating quality of Australia's beef and sheep meat. At this time, I'll hand over to Laura, who will talk to us about MSA Sheepmeat. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks so much, Jodie, and thanks for everyone who's jumped on tonight, and also if you're listening to this recording. So as Jodie said, I will be giving an update on the MSA Sheepmeat program. So jumping into what I'll be covering in tonight's session, we'll be having a look at some consumer trends and insights that are happening globally and domestically, and why eating quality is so important. I'll be touching on MSA Sheepmeat now and into the future. At the moment, we have a current pathway-based system, and the goal over the next 12 months is implementing a cuts-based model for sheep meat, similar to our beef program that we have available for producers and processors. And lastly, I'm going to be touching on selecting for eating quality. So what you can be doing both genetically and then making sure that animals are fed appropriately, but then also where to go for some more information. So in this first section, like I just touched on, looking at some industry insights and current market projections, the importance of eating quality at the farm gate, and then linking that product to consumer outcomes. If we have a look at what the global sheep meat consumption is currently doing, or what it's been doing over the last 30 years, we do have a growing demand for sheep meat, and that's set to continue to rise over the next into that next 5-year period to 2025. So basically, global sheep consumption's grown over 50% in the last 25 years. And there are a few things that come into play with that. So growth is realistically underpinned by population growth. So what we've seen happening with the global population, but also this growing middle class and increasing per capita income. What we know about when consumers have the ability to purchase red meat, or red meat purchases become more consistent within a household, that household is usually earning an income of around $30,000 US. So that's kind of the tipping point. And if we think about areas of global growth and how that relates to sheep meat, few major markets like the US that we're going to see growth in, Asia, so China, Southeast Asia, and Korea, big market players there, but also growing middle class kind of economy and population in the Middle East and North Africa, also a major export area for us. There are some headwinds and some things that provide challenges. So things like price, rising competing proteins, and so not just our other traditional proteins in pork, chicken, beef, but growing proteins around sort of shellfish, fish, and then the alternative plant proteins being made available to our consumers. But overall, the outlook's pretty positive. If we consider where Australia sits in the global protein landscape on a production level, what you can see in front of us is beef production to the left and sheep meat production to the right globally. So being measured on thousands of tons or millions of tons. And in the last 10, 12 years, basically we have seen sheep meat production, which in Australia, represented in that dark green line down the bottom, it stayed pretty consistent relative to the rest of the world. So you can see that rest of the world really ramping up, particularly from sort of that 2018 period. You see a little bit of a spike and growing. This is really important to know that on a production level, we can't really compete necessarily on a commodity basis in both beef and sheep meat. And so this is where having MSA and underpinning brands, product differentiation, and then that clean green image is really, really important for our products around the world. Like I said, to follow on from the last slide, Australia is a small producer, but it plays a big role in global exports. So for beef, global production, we represent 4%, and for sheep meat global production, we represent 6% of the global production. But when it comes to holding an export market share, for beef, we hold 17% of the export market share. So we trail closely behind Brazil, and in recent years, kind of pipping the US in terms of volume on that market share. And then when we think about sheep meat, so that pie graph that you see in the bottom right-hand corner, we represent 38% of global market exports. So in line relatively where New Zealand are competing as well, being our major competitor on the export market. In the last year, in terms of live exports, really strong market for us, but what we saw was the lowest number on record, so it was down 20% on 2020. So only having sort of around that 650,000 head going out on that live export trade. We're expected to see that jump back up to 710,000 by 2023. This will be dependent on the herd rebuild. And a few things that have attributed to this was sort of having that liquidated WA flock. So high volumes of lambs and sheep that are destined for live export coming from WA, but also being in a rebuild phase at the moment across Australia. High demand from restockers for those store animals as well and use. In terms of domestic demand, it's been a pretty interesting time. I think everybody has seen how crazy it's been with COVID, and everybody's sort of seen market shelf, so the retail shelf and the meat section of Coles and Woolies being stripped bare. In terms of the domestic consumption, we saw a rise compared to 2020, and that's expected to continue to grow into 2022. On a price level, this rose by nearly 10% in 2020. And as you can see there on the screen saying, price not having an impact on domestic consumption, with growth still occurring. But one of the most interesting things that we saw coming out of recent years and the pandemic is a rise in online shopping. So seeing that jump by 53% in regards to purchasing lamb and sheep meat, and then supermarket sales being up by about 7.5%. In terms of the national lamb slaughter, we've had pretty great conditions in the last 18 months on all of our lamb sheep meat growing kind of regions. We are sitting in what would be a typical rebuild phase, so coming out of a drought from more than 2 years ago. But one of the interesting things to see out of 2021 and then what we'll see going into 2022, incredibly high marking rates, larger joining percentages. And what that will mean is that we'll have higher lamb volumes for slaughter. So we'll see rising in slaughter numbers. So up to about 22.2 million set for next year, but also more lambs retained as well. So just a higher volume of lambs across the flock that will be going both into slaughter and then being retained. In terms of carcass weights and production, for lamb, we saw carcass weights up by about 100 grams, so up to that average weight of 24.8 kilos. And for our kind of sheep classes, so above, so hogget and mutton, getting up to 25.6 kilos. Again, we're expecting a new production record for the 2023 period. So looking at 555,000 tonnes of lamb produced, but in terms of sheep meat and our hogget and mutton categories, expecting to see those kind of tip back a bit because of sitting, again, like I said, sitting in that rebuild phase at the moment. Now, the projections that I have just shown are from our October update. We have the marketing team will be delivering a webinar on sheep meat industry projections for 2022. That will come out next Friday, the 18th of February, following from their projections publication being released next Tuesday. So if you are interested in jumping on, as well as seeing the recording of the webinar for the cattle projections that was delivered last week, you can do that by visiting MLA home and then the prices and markets section, or we'll have this link available at the end of the presentation too. So now that we've kind of seen that there is that growing demand, there's lambs that are available, and we're trying to feed the consumer, it's really important that we loop back around to why eating quality is so important and what it means for our industry and then back through to our producers. And this is where with MSA was developed in response to that declining beef and sheep meat consumption that was being seen sort of in the 80s and 90s, early 90s. When we did some consumer retail surveying, we found that 20% of loins actually failed to meet consumer expectations. And the importance of that is, if you think about, the loin is like the best cut in the carcass. And so if you've got 1 in 5 loins failing, imagine what all the other cuts are doing. So it's really crucial that we understand what consumers and customers think of our product and we respond to that. And that's what really underpins MSA and where we got started. A key part of our program is doing consumer sensory testing of product that then goes on to underpin our models for beef and now sheep meat. And when we ask everyday consumers to take part in our research and development, we get them to rate product, and that comes out at a score of a 3-star, 4-star, or 5-star. The importance of that is 3 stars, basically a good product, 4-star is better than everyday product, and 5-star is what people would consider a premium product. Now, what you can see in front of you is that we've done this consumer sensory testing for sheep meat, Australian sheep meat, in our major markets, including the US, China, and domestically in Australia. We ask people when they take part in this consumer sensory testing what they would pay for that product. Now, the actual number that they say, like, I'll pay, $20 per kilo, that number will change, but the ratio of the price compared to good, better than everyday, and a premium product, that ratio is consistent in all markets that we do consumer sensory testing. We see basically the same graph when we do this in beef, and we've tested that in 12 different countries. So what we know is when someone has a good product, they'll usually pay half as much again for a better product. And going from a good product to a premium product, people are willing to pay twice as much. When we know that, and we have the ability to differentiate products, so giving people a premium product and that they can pay for that, that's really important, because we don't want people paying premium prices for just good product and vice versa. It's also really important to note that you can go from a good product, so that 3-star, people still pay for something that fails, but they'll only pay half as much. And what we know about consumers today is that we have so much choice that if we have something that fails, we're pretty happy not to ever purchase it again. So this is really important information going forward for our industry. Now, lamb is considered a bit of a premium product when you start comparing it to your other major proteins. And the slide that I have in front of you now is actually the relative retail price of the 4 major proteins: beef, pork, lamb, and chicken. And on a cents per kilo basis across all cuts, what the price has been on the retail shelf. So in the last 20 years, we can see that beef has increased quite a lot. So trading from around that $10 per kilo across all cuts to now sitting above $20 per kilo as an average across all cuts and product. The interesting one to note is chicken in orange, that is flatlined at 500 cents. Chicken is an incredibly efficient product with vertically integrated systems. And so they haven't necessarily changed in the last 20 years, but chickens also, I hope there's no chicken farmers on this presentation, but it's pretty plain and boring. Where lamb, what we can see is that we've seen lamb rise over the last 20 years, and it's basically trading at 3 times the price of chicken. So price is a major factor, but people are still willing to pay for it, but we need to make sure that they get the right product. It's considered amongst a lot of families to be, and a lot of consumers to be, a special occasion meal. Typically, at this point in time, viewed as like I was saying, a premium product. So has a strong presence in food service industry. And the big thing is flavor is key. So one of the things around where an opportunity does lie, however, is increasing purchasing and consumption frequency. So MLA have been working a lot in the domestic market team to show lamb as both being a special occasion meal and a premium product, but also an everyday product. So if you go into a metropolitan area and you see the adverts on the sides of bus stands and billboards, and if you go to this Australian Open, you'll actually see a lot of the marketing more targeted to lamb every day. Taking a step away from some of that more consumer and market trend stuff and coming a little bit closer to back on farm and the effects of feeding quality, what I have in front of you on this slide is the terminal lamb genetic trends for carcass traits over time. And so many of people on the session tonight will be aware that over time, we've had a decrease in eating quality in lamb, and we've also been producing bigger, heavier, leaner lambs as well. So just looking at this graph showing the ASBV and the trends over the last 20 years, what we can see by driving genetic gain in muscle and growth, as well as breeding those trimmer lambs, it's been favourable for lean meat yield, so the blue line, and along with that has pulled along shear force as a trait. Intramuscular fat over time has been decreasing a little bit, and those traits are negatively correlated. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But what it has worked to do is by having that lean meat yield driving up and IMF driving down a little, is that it's actually driven overall liking down quite a lot. So this is something we really need to be aware of, particularly in our terminal breeds. Although I've just said that we've had increasing in lean meat yield and shear force traits, if we look at the resource flock, so just to touch on, MLA runs a resource flock across 2 sites, so Katanning and Armidale. They're sites that are joined to commercial flock use via AI. The lambs that come from, so the progeny, they're all raised together under similar circumstances, and these progeny go through to slaughter with a bunch of carcass, phenotype measurements taken, and then these are related then back to the genotyping and the genetic information we have about the individuals and their size. So what we know from our resource flock, and this is the 2017 kill data, is that realistically, we have so much variation across the flock in terms of eating quality that standard carcass or hot carcass weight is not an indicator of eating quality. So there's no correlation between those two. And what you can see is down towards the 14, 19 kilo carcasses, you've got animals that eat really well, sitting above the red line, and animals that don't sit so well. It's the same if you go up to the other end of the scale, getting up above 30 kilos in carcass weight. You've got animals that are eating really well, have high eating quality, and animals that don't. So this is just a really important thing to consider, that there's just as much variation within the flock, and that carcass weight doesn't necessarily link to eating quality. Now, one thing, as I touched on before, around the fact that we've got lean meat yield and intramuscular fat being negatively correlated traits. This is an example of a flock currently in the terminal analysis. And what they have seen from the early 2000s is that their IMF intramuscular fat was decreasing, and their lean meat yield was increasing, in that, what we would expect to see with negatively correlated traits. But by using ASBVs, it enables breeders to be able to select for eating quality traits, and while also improving yield. So if you look at around 2014, you see the bending of the curve. So you see IMF starting to creep back up, as well as lean meat yield still on that rising plateau. So it's able to be done. And I'll talk about selecting for or considering eating quality ASBVs in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. Lastly, to touch on this section is that eating quality variation does occur across all cuts. So we know this circumstantially. You've got your loins that'll eat really well, so those postural muscles that don't do tons of work, versus sort of your leg and rump muscles that do more work, usually tend to be tougher. So we know that variation occurs between cuts, but it also occurs across cuts. And I'm just going to bring up these bars to show that currently what we have available for consumers is that we're putting loins, if they're coming from the same types of animals, so all lambs, and they're going through the same slaughter process, you could have lamb loins that are ending up in the same box. So lamb loin in red, the red line, ones that are going to fail consumer expectations, ones that will be good, so sitting between the red and then the first blue line. That first blue line sits at around 64, and then going across, moving up past that, you go into a 4-star or better product, better than every day. And that line, that second blue line sitting above 80, once you get past that, that's where your premium product is sitting. So we do know that variation is occurring. And by having a cut space model, we can measure this in the carcass and know that we can separate out that product and do brand differentiation like we've been doing in beef. So the ultimate goal is to get rid of all of these failed products being on the shelf and making sure that nobody has a product like that. So moving into our next section, MSA Sheepmeat, what it currently looks like, what a cut space model looks like, and then what else we're working on in terms of R&D. So MSA, it looks at it's a consumer-focused model to improve eating quality at every step through the whole value chain. So we have recommendations and requirements every step along the way. So from farm gate through to the processor, if it's gone via a sale yard, and all the way along till it ends up on the consumer plate. With sheep meat, it's all around managing critical control points. So pre and post slaughter control points. So knowing things, what we know pre-slaughter is things like genetics, age, growth path, intramuscular fat. These all have an impact on eating quality from on farm, and then ultimately what's on the consumer plate. But then post-slaughter, how the carcass is hung, the chilling regimes, how it's displayed at the retail shelf, the cut, all those things can also have an impact at what happens as before it heads onto the consumer plate. One thing that we have been able to do with MSA, and as I was saying before, we had this declining consumption in sheep meat that we were trying to address, and knowing that 20% of lamb loins were failing. One thing that we do know about consumers, and looking at this pre-MSA graph on the slide in front of you, is going from green to amber to red. So between amber and red is around 5 kilos of shear force. When a consumer eats a product that is in that 5 kilo shear force and above, it's too tough, and so it will fail consumer expectations. Anything kind of around a 3 and above for shear force, it may or may not, depending on other traits of that sample or piece of meat. And what we've been able to do with MSA is, by having correct stimulation in plants, is that we've reduced that tail straight off of all the product that is failing, and having meat that is sort of above that 5 kilos of shear force. The thing to note about this, though, is that the post-MSA research that we did, this is based back in 2006, so it's starting to become a bit dated. If we were to replicate this now, and given what we know about the lambs coming through, the tenderness of them, and the information that we have on lean meat yield, it's likely that we will probably see a little bit of a tail start to increase again, just because we have, over the last 15 to 20 years, been breeding for faster growing, heavier and trimmer animals. MSA is based on 100,000 consumer taste tests, and we ask people about tenderness, juiciness, flavour, and overall liking of product when they take part in our consumer testing, which underpins all of our research and development projects. And what this produces is a eating quality score, or a SQ4 score. And then we also ask people to rate, did they think it was unsatisfactory, good every day, better than every day, and premium quality. And from that, and managing our critical control points, what we have in place at the moment is the MSA Sheepmeat Cut by Cook. And so depending on the category, lamb, hogget, mutton, cut, cook method, then explains where it can fall in terms of the eligibility for the MSA program. But it is basically an in or out at this point in time. Our requirements to supply MSA sheep and lambs for producers isn't going to change over the next, as we introduced a cuts-based model. So if you're not already an MSA producer and you're considering this, I would suggest you jump online or get in contact with us and we can get you registered. It's free to join. And we just require that to be eligible, you correctly fill out your LPA NVD. And then we have what's called the rule of twos. So minimum of 2 weeks off shears, fat score of greater than 2, time off feed, no greater than 2 days, and then having cut lambs and sheep on the property for 2 weeks before dispatch. In terms of what I've been going on about with this cut by cook prediction model, at this point in time, this is our first iteration. And what it will do is take 3 main inputs. So hot standard carcass weight, lean meat yield, which will be measured either by DEXA, so dual energy X-ray, or through a GR algorithm or calculation. So DEXA is the more accurate way to predict lean meat yield of a carcass. Then we'll require an intramuscular fat measurement. And then after that, it'll take into account the electrical stimulation that's been applied to a carcass and aging 5 to 21 days. At the moment in beef, we have an aging prediction out to 50 days, but this hasn't always been the case. And we're doing some research also around longer aging periods for lamb. And what this will give us is a predicted eating quality score for the cuts that you see on the screen. So knuckle, loin, outside, rump, top side for a grill cook method, and for roast, your knuckle, leg, rack, and shoulder. So when we have the ability to apply this to a carcass, we'll get a eating quality score for these cuts by this cook method, and it'll tell us, is it going to fail consumer expectations, be good, better than every day, or a premium product? So very similar to what we kind of have in beef. Our beef model is quite sophisticated with a lot of carcass grading attributes that go into that. It's at its 10th iteration, and it sort of basically calculates out at the moment 269 cut by cook combinations. So over time, this will grow. Now, the big thing in terms of making all of this happen is the research that we do. We've got a lot of research happening in terms of packaging. So we know that modified atmospheric packaging can increase shelf life of product, but it also has an impact and can reduce eating quality. So doing work in that space, we've done it in beef as well. We use the resource flock and sensory evaluation to not only underpin genomic prediction of eating quality and relate that back to ASBVs that are calculated for across multiple breeds, but we also use those resource flock sensory evaluation to go into our model. So that research going into the prediction of our model, and also being used to test a lot of the technologies to measure IMF, which I will jump to now. At the moment, there are 4 really promising technologies to measure intramuscular fat. The thing that is kind of holding up being able to predict eating quality on a cuts-based model is being able to get that accurate IMF measurement in a commercial plant and at chain speed. And at the moment, the MEQ probe is the only IMF technology that's been accredited and is now commercially available, and that's operating in Gundagai meat processors. The next 3 technologies are still in their testing phase. So we've got the ASDR near infrared. This is a project that sits with New South Wales DPI, and what it does is takes a near infrared, so light measurement, but at the top side, and we calculate out how that relates to the loin. The Soma Optics NIR is a piece of technology that's come out of Japan, and it is commercially being used to measure fat and IMF in tuna. So that's been doing a lot of work over the last few years to get that calibrated and used for lamb. And the master lamb and master beef is a cut surface, so a camera technology that, again, taking a picture of that, and then the pixelation being able to differentiate the IMF percentage. And if I show you what that looks like, these are all being measured or to be commercially viable to operate between 2 and 6% IMF. And I'll just show you, that's what those, with my bouncy little percentages, that's what the difference between 2% and 6% IMF actually looks like. We get the same effect happening in beef. People get very excited about marbling, but every little bit of marbling has an impact on eating quality. So you don't necessarily have to go out and look for genetics like your Wagyus to increase IMF. You can be making genetic decisions within your own breed and your preferred sire selection that will increase IMF incrementally over time. And so that's just a really important thing to note as we move forward and we get more feedback available back to producers, which brings me to my next slide. What's producer feedback actually going to look like when we have this cuts-based model? So ultimately what we'd like to see is feedback that we provide around that's similar to what beef producers have available. So the MSA index is an overall eating quality score of a carcass. So for sheep producers also getting their lambs and sheep meat, their sheep kills back and seeing what an overall eating quality score for that carcass was like. This could be, it will depend on mob base or individual readings, and also being able to look at compliance as well. So this is what we have available for our MSA beef producers. If you can sign carcasses, you can get your index and you can start to benchmark how you've performed compared to other producers in your state, region, or nationally. You can look at carcass attributes over time. So again, this is just the index. And for this producer, we can see over the last year, consignments that were turned off, what his index on average has been for that group or that consignment. And ultimately, we can start to map also what compliance looks like. So compliance to specs. And this is quite informative for our processors and able to see sort of seasonal trends and how that relates back to carcass performance as well. And lastly, then linking that in with health data too. So one thing that we're currently working on is how eating quality and animal health is linked. And what you can see is MSA index by health status, so diseased versus non-diseased, and pretty clear to see that blue line is, for the most part, healthy animals performing better on eating quality, which is what we would expect. But yeah, again, being quite informative for producers as well to understand maybe what's impacting eating quality. So moving along, what's the role of genetics in eating quality? So we know eating quality traits are highly heritable. So the big drivers when it comes to genetic traits are our IMF and our shear force. And then being able to measure the traits of eating quality, so your tenderness, juiciness, and flavor, and overall liking, by understanding how these work together, how genetics influences that, is going to influence consumer satisfaction. So when we link those ASBVs to eating quality, what we know when we increase IMF is that it plays a huge role in boosting juiciness, flavour, and overall liking, while having a bit of an effect on tenderness. But by decreasing shear force, that has our biggest impact on tenderness, while having slightly less impact on juiciness, flavour, and overall liking. So these two, being able to apply pressure for both of those, goes hand in hand. And given the, as I highlighted earlier, the impact of selecting for lean meat yield has been at the expense of eating quality, the sheep genetics team have recently moved to include eating quality traits in every terminal index. So for our terminal size, terminal breeds, that work to turn that impact on eating quality around. So what a selection index does, it combines a number of traits in the breeding objective into one ranking figure, and that just assists breeders in managing these negative correlations. So we can make sure that we're moving the traits that we want both in a positive direction rather than negatively correlated traits when we apply selection pressure on one comes at the expense of the other. So what we have available in terminal selection indexes now is, do you want to basically increase lean meat yield and growth and those sorts of things while maintaining eating quality? So you can select, do that through a terminal carcass production index. But if you're actually looking to improve eating quality and then taking into account improving worm resistance too, those come down to eating quality index and lamb eating quality index. So that's just in terminal size and breeds at the moment. But if we're thinking about breeding for eating quality, it's really important that overall, when it comes to genetics, that you have a defined breeding objective. So what traits and potentially index are you selecting for? So what are your profit drivers? And these doesn't just include your eating quality type traits and growth traits, but could include your reproductive traits too. So what are you trying to select for? And knowing how that's going to impact profit. Then where are you currently sitting? And so what commercial producers, if they're buying and using rams with ASBVs, what they have the ability to do is ram team tracking. So for a particular trait, looking at that ASBV as an average across your ram team and looking at that over time. So in the example there, we've got EQ just being tracked from 2017 through to 2019. And we can see there that it gets up to 133 in 2019. But that doesn't actually mean a lot unless you're comparing to the rest of the flock. And so linking that back into our percentile band. So where is it that you want to be going? And if you look at the percentile table down there, by having that 133 unit, basically indicative that you're sitting in the top 30%, or your RAM team on average is sitting in the top 30% for that trait and ASBV. Feeding is also obviously incredibly important. You can have fantastic genes, but if you do not feed them, you'll never see that expression. So really important to keep lambs and sheep on a rising plane of nutrition leading up to slaughter. So this is incredibly important in the last 30 days, and that you don't have dips in nutrition. The type of finishing system in our research has shown that it does have little effect on eating quality. So grain versus grass at this point in time has little impact on eating quality, but it's really, really important that we keep weight in front of them, and our pre-slaughter minimum growth rates for crossbreds is doing at least 100 grams per head per day, and merinos 150 grams per head per day. If that feed isn't keeping up to them and the energy, it's likely that the glycogen or energy stored in the muscles will be quite low, and that's going to have an impact when it comes to slaughter being converted to lactic acid, and then having an impact on the toughness of that meat. And like I said earlier in the requirements, lambs and sheep need to be finished to a minimum fat score of 2 to be MSA eligible. If you're looking for some more information, I'm sure Jody was alluding to that you guys have done a lot of feeding and nutrition webinars in the last year. But for some more information on nutrition and growth, you can head to the Making More from Sheep resources available. Otherwise, reach out to the guys at Sheep Connect as well. And lastly, just touching back on this breeder and the genetic trends that they've been able to shift. Like I said earlier, it is possible to have, even though these are negatively correlated traits, we can apply selection pressure by correctly utilizing ASBVs and really start to turn that around as well. So this is where I give a little bit of a shout out to the sheep genetics team. They deliver the national genetic evaluation for sheep and are responsible for the Australian sheep breeding values, so ASBV, and they deliver this to over 950 flocks and across multiple breeds. If you are interested in finding out a bit more relative to your sire type, please reach out to the team. We have a Land Plan Development Officer, Gabby Sharing, and then our Merino Select Development Officer, Chloe Bunter, who are both also located in Armidale. And finally, we've got some tips and tools around intramuscular fat and eating quality, as well as lean meat yield. These are available on our website, and I can make these available to be sent around after the webinar. And if you're a producer and you're looking for what's sort of next, the MLA Genetics Hub hosts information around genetics aimed at commercial producers, and making it easy to understand and implement within your business. We have productivity and profitability webinars that happen nearly every month. These are with MLA and run, happening monthly. We've got Bred Well, Fed Well workshops, profitable grazing systems training packages, and then if there is a group that's interested, we also have producer demonstration sites and programs that are available for producers wanting to learn more and implement this. So pretty much to wrap up, I think I have spent a lot of time talking about genetics heavily impacting eating quality and touching on ASBVs and indexes. These are quite key for the ability to improve eating quality, particularly at the moment, just being on the verge of having producer feedback available, genetic selection and changes to genetics. These all take a lot of time. So we encourage people to be ahead of the 8 ball and be considering those eating quality traits for a point in time in which product segregation and branding may be influencing grid prices. And then our biggest recommendation is to follow nutrition and management guidelines to maximise that final carcass outcome. So that's pretty much me. So thank you very much for tuning in. Jodie, are there any questions?
We have got a couple of questions. So the question,
yes.
First question, and I guess it's probably you're in South Australia. How far away is that type of producer feedback for our South Australian producers? We've got a few producers want to know when they're going to get feedback looking like that.
Yeah, then that is a very good question, and I am about to give you an it depends answer. So we're working with multiple processes at the moment. Like I was saying, having a technology in plant to measure IMF is the thing that, and we've been talking about it in industry, it's the thing that we're waiting on. And it will depend on the plant and how it will fit into its operation as well. So having something that suits the plant and the chain speed, as well as the integration of software that they currently have available. So I'm not answering it with a definitive, it'll be out in X amount of time, because for every plant, it will be different. It'll be a different journey to have that technology in place. And then things like mob versus individual, that will come into play as well. It would be great if we can see, you know, the dream would be to have it like beef, where we have individual carcass data, because of you know, RFID and individual identification, but it may look that you might get some mob-based producer feedback with MSA first, and again, depending on the plant in which you're sending sheep to as well.
So hopefully soonish. Soonish being the operative word.
Yeah.
No, excellent. A producer just texted through and said, can you just recap on what sheep breeding values they should be looking for when buying rams for eating quality?
Yep, for sure. So your things, so your IMF ASBVs, keeping an eye on things like lean meat yield, and then shear force. So IMF and shear force, and then a little bit of an eye on lean meat yield. And then if you have the ability to, if you're purchasing terminal sires, those terminal sire indexes as well.
Excellent. There's some great information on the Sheep Genetics website if you need some more. Or flick me a message, send me an email, the message you would have got to register for tonight's webinar, and I can certainly direct you to the Sheep Genetics website where that stuff's located. Another question, and we've talked generally about sheep meat, and the person obviously has mixed breeds. They want to know how the composites compare to their traditional terminals, and how do they compare to merinos and other breeds within, for sheep meat. Do you have information on that, about how eating quality varies between breeds?
So what we do know is that there's, and I know that this is such a cliche thing to say as well, but there is just as much variation like within breeds as there are between. And I don't have a slide. We have got some information from the resource flock that kind of shows that, you know, you can have great eating quality merinos and you can have poor ones, and the same as you can have great eating quality in some terminal sires or some terminal progeny and not as much in others. Like, it's just, the variation's pretty great. So yeah, we can't comment on what it's like between your different breed or sire types, because I'm sorry, I don't have something that I can visually show just at the moment, but the variation is quite broad.
Thank you to everyone who's joined us for tonight's webinar. Laura, thank you for sharing your insight and expertise. If you've got any other questions that come to you later on, send me an email. We thank you for your time in attending tonight's webinar, and have a lovely evening. Cheers.